All right. Welcome everyone to today's session about APIOps and transforming Azure APIM deployments with GitOps and DevOps methodology. My name is Wael Kadu. I am a principal cloud solution architect here at Microsoft. I will be your presenter for today. Just want to go ahead and mention some of my colleagues who are the co-creators of the APIOps tool, which will be the topic of today's discussion. I have Rishab Saha, who's also an architect here at Microsoft, Guy Fenkham, who's also a colleague here, a cloud solution architect, as well as Srini Padala, who's also a cloud solution architect. So for today's session, as I mentioned, we're really going to be focusing on APIOps as your go-to tool for everything Azure APIM DevOps. And before I kind of jump into the details of how the tool works, I'll also be kind of demoing, doing an end-to-end demo later on. So you definitely want to stay tuned to the end of the session where we will basically take all the theory and kind of show you the practical usage of all these great ideas that we actually introduce as part of APIOps. So one of the things that I always think about APIOps is we really need to talk about whenever we talk about APIOps, we essentially need to understand how to apply the concept of DevOps and GitOps to the APIM lifecycle. But before we dive into that, it's important to understand how does the adoption of APIM impacts DevOps. So I love this meme here that we're looking at on the screen, because in a sense it really applies to all of us. And typically as an API developer, whenever you're using Azure APIM as a product, more often than not, you are the API developer, and you're typically excited about creating APIs. But whenever we hand it to the DevOps team, this is where typically things start to become a bit tricky, because at this point, really, do you know for sure whether it will work or not? So you typically just go ahead and say, I hope, or even pray that it will just work. And as we all know, more often than not, it doesn't really work without a solid DevOps process in place. So when introducing new API designs, the impact of DevOps engineer is often forgotten, right? The impact on these engineers is really often forgotten. And this is where if our feature teams or your server tier developers are experimenting with the solutions, unless your DevOps process is formalized, it's normal to be prone to failures in production if DevOps cannot successfully deploy them. So within the context of Azure APIM, the impact on the DevOps engineer is often forgotten, right? And I'd like to kind of repeat that because you typically care about, hey, am I creating an API on Azure APIM? If you're using your portal or your Azure CLI, and then you kind of really forget that this has to actually be automated at one point. So this is the beauty of what APIOps is all about, is to actually have that process in place from the get-go, so that later on, whether it's your operator or your API developer, they will have some kind of tool, right, and process in place for them to actually utilize and kind of self-serve. So one of the reasons why we combine the concept of GitOps, which is typically mainly around using Git as the source of truth, with Azure APIM, is because all the components that you deploy within Azure APIM have a declarative approach, right? So say, for example, you are creating an API specification, those can be created declaratively, or say, for example, you are creating some service level information like logging or monitoring, diagnostics. All these can also be created declaratively. Typically, it's a combination of JSON and YAML files, which again we will demonstrate later on once we look at some of the demos. So let's kind of, double click a little bit into the what, right? So as you can probably tell from the title of the talk, APIOps applies the concepts of GitOps and DevOps to API deployment. So the idea there when we first envisioned the tool was that by using practices from these two methodologies, APIOps can enable everyone involved in the lifecycle of API design, development, and deployment with self-service and automated tools. This basically ensures the quality of specifications and the APIs that they're typically building. And the beauty of having such tools in place is that, in addition to obviously introducing a solid DevOps process, and automation, it also allows you to kind of ensure better quality as well as speed due to obviously this level of automation that we're enabling with APIOps. Now, some considerations, that, we had in mind when we were designing APIOps are mainly around design and testing, deployment, as well as maintenance. So the idea there is that we wanted to enable the different personas that are typically involved in an Azure APIM deployment. So that's your operators. Usually these are, the folks who are responsible for service level, artifacts. Again, we kind of mentioned them earlier, things like logging, diagnostics, maybe global policies and things like that. But also we have our, API developers. Obviously, these are the folks kind of doing the day-to-day deployments, modifications, and maybe introductions of new APIs. These are folks that typically would spend more time around, open API specs or maybe, API level policies and things like that. So we want to kind of enable these, folks, and these are kind of the main targets to our APIOps tool, mainly being the operators as well as the API developers. So by giving them, a tool like APIOps, the goal there is that from the get-go, they will have a clear process on how to kind of self-serve in terms of designing these APIs or, global assets, and then testing them, and then also automating their deployment. And later on, obviously maintaining them, right? Kind of saying that, hey, we have things that already exist, for instance, on an APIM instance. I would like to go ahead and maybe modify it and then push more changes against the live instance, which again, we will demonstrate later on once we take a look at the demo. So again, let's double click on some of these ideas there. So in terms of the design, testing, and deployment, again, because GitOps is at the heart of everything that we did with APIOps, it all starts, obviously with having a source control, Git source control. That's going to be your source of truth. And then you as a developer, say, for instance, you're sitting inside your favorite IDE. That could be, for example, something like VS Code. You're working with specific, maybe API specifications, like your Open API specification, or even, if you're an operator, you could, for instance, be working with a policy. There are certain extensions, for instance, in IDEs like VS Code, which even allows you, for instance, to debug some of these policies, make sure they're, working fine. And once you're ready, you would go ahead and, again, use the usual commit and push with Git. And that allows you to kind of trigger that whole pipeline or process, within your DevOps environment in order to kind of take these, designs and actually push them against your live APIM instance. Again, when I say live, I'm not necessarily talking about, production only. Obviously, you can have multiple live instances. Some of them, purposes of doing some, testing or QA, and then obviously production, which is exactly what we encourage with APIOps, to have these multiple environments. And then that's the beauty of APIOps, because it allows you to kind of promote these changes as you go from one environment to another really easily because of this level of automation, which again, I will be demonstrating shortly, so you can have a better understanding of how actually all that works. In addition to the design, testing, and deployment, also we enable another scenario, which we like to kind of refer to as the maintenance, and that is we support the extraction aspect. So what I really showed you there in the previous slide, you can think about it as the publishing aspect. That's, in a sense, if you think about APIOps, it's really a combination of two binaries, for lack of better terms. One of them is really the extractor, and the other is the publisher. Now, you could use the publisher only, which is what I just discussed in the previous slide, and that is the idea of just simply saying, I'm going to go ahead and develop in some kind of IDE. I do a git push. That git push typically initiates the creation of some kind of PR. And then once you merge that PR, after you're reviewing it, maybe just making sure everything looks right, that can trigger a deployment against your APIM instance. So you could, for example, just set up a DevOps process, which constitutes just the publishing aspect. But a lot of times we see a lot of our customers, what they do is they typically like, for example, to start with an existing APIM instance and then extract any artifacts in that APIM instance and then promote these changes to higher environments, while maybe slightly changing some of the configurations. Say, for instance, pointing to a different backend API, or maybe having different named value pairs, or things that would kind of differ across environments. So we enable that scenario as well, and this is covered by what we like to call the extractor inside APIOps. So it's the best thing to kind of think about. APIOps, just it's two different binaries or processes. One of them is for the extraction, and the other one is for publishing. Now, if you use the extraction, obviously it will involve the publishing at one point, because whatever you extract, you need to publish it later on. But the publishing aspect does not require the extractor to be involved, because like I said earlier, you could just, for example, start from scratch from within your IDE. You push your changes, commit your changes to your Git repo, and then just trigger the publishing. We have all that heavily documented, on our main repo. So again, I'll be showing you later on, some really good starting points where to kind of start with APIOps, and some links to the documentation, which really explains all these aspects in details. So let's kind of take a look here at an end-to-end. If you look at this image here, notice we have a couple things that are involved. Obviously, the APIM instance itself. We also have the different personas. We have your API developers and then your operators. So your operators, typically, these are the folks who are responsible for, service level assets, things like agnostics, logging, global policies, and then your API developers who are really working against specific APIs. Typically, you have, scenarios where maybe same API developers are working against all the APIs in the APIM instance, but you may have different scenarios where you may have different developers working on different APIs. Obviously, at the time of this session, Workspaces is currently in public preview. There is some work to actually eventually bring support for Workspaces into APIOps. And you can actually check that out on our roadmap within our GitHub repo for the APIOps project. So rest assured, if you're somebody today kind of looking at Workspaces, under Azure APIM, and you're like, will APIOps ever support that? The answer is yes. But again, at the time of delivering this session when you're watching it right now, workspaces has not been fully implemented yet. So just something to keep in mind. So we do have some kind of workarounds. Again, you will find it in the documentation where we kind of we have some recommendations on how to kind of emulate the support for multiple API teams with APIOps. So you can kind of read that on your own. But rest assured, in the future, we will bring support for workspaces. So as you can see here, if you look at the extraction aspect of it, it allows you to run a pipeline, which actually extracts from the Azure APIM instance. And this extraction typically triggers creation of a PR. And then that PR, after it gets reviewed and approved, it will actually trigger the, and it gets merged into the main branch. It actually triggers the publisher pipeline, which goes ahead and publishes these changes back to the APIM instance. Now, this image doesn't really capture the full story, because in reality, when you publish, you don't have to really publish back to the same APIM instance. More often than not, let's be real here, your intent is really going to be to take anything that you've maybe extracted and kind of promote it to a higher environment. This image really mainly captures the scenario where you're probably working inside an IDE and you made some changes and you want to go ahead and publish it to the specific API instance. Typically, it's your lower environment, but just understand that you can also publish to higher environments. And we actually even have a full configuration system inside APIOps, which allows you to kind of override values as you're promoting these changes from one environment to another. You know what? Let's go ahead and do this. Why don't we go ahead and switch to the demo here? I would like to kind of show you how to demo all this in action. So in order to do that, I set up here an Azure DevOps environment. Now, I do want to be clear. I am demonstrating user Azure DevOps, for the purposes of this demo. But by all means, feel free to, host all this inside a GitHub repo. As a matter of fact, let me switch really quickly. I want to show you kind of the main repository where we host all this. So this is going to be on github.com/Azure/APIOps. And you will notice in here, we do actually have a link to the documentation. So if you follow the documentation, we kind of demonstrate everything, from the extraction to the publishing, using both GitHub as well as Azure DevOps. Now, I have received in the past some questions. Some people may say, okay, well, you are actually demonstrating using Microsoft DevOps tools, mainly being Azure DevOps and GitHub. But what if we're using un-Microsoft tools, right? So just as an example, maybe you're using Jenkins or something else. We do offer the pipelines only for Azure DevOps and GitHub out of the box, but that doesn't mean you can't take these pipelines and adapt them to your own environment, right? So for example, you could use something like Microsoft Copilot and say, hey, Microsoft Copilot, take these pipelines and convert them to me to Jenkins pipelines. So at the end of the day, really what these pipelines that we're providing you with, you can think about them as turnkey solutions, so that you don't have to take our extractor and publisher binaries and kind of figure out how do I start integrating these within some DevOps pipelines. So the best way to think about APIOps is the combination of the binary, which are the two binaries, which are the extractor and publisher, and then the set of DevOps pipeline. And these are two independent components. For the most part, I would say 99%, the extractor and publisher are really oblivious to the DevOps environment within which they're running. And I say 99%, again, as you go through the documentation, you will notice there are a couple extensions that we have to install in Azure DevOps and GitHub, mainly being the replace token extension. But aside from that, everything is self-contained in the extractor and publisher. As a matter of fact, You can take these extractors and publishers and run them local on your machine if you want. They're just two .NET applications, .NET, applications built in C#, right? If you really wanted to kind of know the details. So out of the box, yes, we are only providing you with the GitHub and Azure DevOps pipelines, but by no means this means that you are restricted to these, right? And you can kind of find them here. Again, once you go into the releases, you will notice, again, it's a good idea to always kind of, maybe follow our releases on GitHub so you get notified whenever a new release gets pushed. So for example, if you take a look here, you'll notice some of the assets that we provide you. You'll notice we have the DevOps pipelines as well as the GitHub pipelines. So feel free to take these. If you want to adapt them, say, to your Jenkins, just go ahead and adapt them. We just offer these two out of the box, which are Azure DevOps as well as GitHub. All right, so let's go back to kind of showing you the demo here. So as you can see here, typically, just to kind of start from scratch, I'm going to go ahead and delete these artifacts. So let me do one thing here because I know this is going to trigger my pipeline. Let me cancel the run here for a second because I want to show you everything running from scratch. All right, so let's go ahead and cancel this one. Okay, perfect. So if you go back and look at the repo, typically you don't have any artifacts. So I'm going to show you the scenario where you want to start with an existing APIM instance. So if I show you here on my Azure, portal, notice I have a resource group which includes what constitutes the lower environment. So I'm going to go ahead and show you some of the APIs here which I would like to promote to a higher environment, right? So these APIs have already been created. So I have a lot of these APIs. We have a bunch of named value pairs, some policy fragments, some API tags, some API level policies, as well as maybe some policies that will apply to all APIs. And if you look here, you will notice that I have another APIM instance, which is right now is empty, right? So I don't have any APIs. I don't have any of the named value pairs that I showed you earlier. This is just an empty APIM instance. And then I'm going to demonstrate here by using APIOps how we are able to actually go ahead and extract everything. So I'm going to start with the extractor pipeline here, and then we're going to look at the end-to-end process here where we go ahead and look at the artifacts being extracted. So while this is running, I just want to kind of talk about a couple of things that will happen here. So you will notice that we're going to go ahead and extract from the lower environment, which in this case, you can think about it as maybe the development environment. And then the artifacts are going to be extracted and a pull request is going to be created, right? As a good DevOps practice, it's not a good idea to kind of, extract and just go ahead and add it to the main branch. So we will notice that there is a PR that will get created. And once this PR gets created, what will happen is I'm going to go to that PR. Typically in a real life scenario, you would have a couple approvers for say, for the sake of time here and just for demoing purposes, I will be the only approver. So I will approve what I just extracted, but obviously in a production environment, you don't want to do that, right? At least have maybe 2 or 3 approvers. They would review your code, see the changes, make sure everything looks right. And then once you go ahead and approve that, you will merge. And at that point, once we go ahead and merge these changes to the main branch, and again, you could change that behavior, for example. At the end of the day, it's just a DevOps environment. It's up to you to kind of determine, how things will work for you. And, once the actual extraction is done, that PR is created, we merged. What you will notice there is that the publisher pipeline will actually be triggered. Now, this is where the beauty of this whole process is, right? So we extracted these artifacts just by running a single pipeline. And if you recall what I mentioned in the earlier slides, I said these actual artifacts are actually going to be all declarative. So that's the beauty, right? That we can go ahead and take these artifacts, run them through the publisher, and then it'll go ahead and publish all these changes for you to a higher environment using this end-to-end DevOps process while using automation. So that's really what it is in a nutshell. We will give it here another maybe minute just so that we wait for the extractor. By the way, you may have seen a slight error here while I was running. Just for the, for my demo, I had a step here which is running a spectral linting. Again, I just didn't have all the spectral linting right. So just in case you're wondering, hey, wow, we saw a failure there, what's going on? Don't worry about it. Typically, you would make sure that in your case, you have the proper linting, which, by the way, it's really a nice step to make sure that whatever you're actually about to promote is indeed valid, for example, open API spec and whatnot. So we should see the pull request here. This is the active pull request. It just got created right now. We're going to go ahead. Again, typically you would have an approval process. Just for the sake of this demo, I'm going to go ahead and merge it automatically. So the beauty of that is you'll notice that all these artifacts just got created. And for you as a developer, this is amazing, right? Because this is what you as a developer kind of understand. So if you try to kind of map what you're seeing here, right, to what you see on the Azure portal, it's really easy to kind of map one-to-one. Like these are the APIs, the named values, so on and so forth. And if you kind of look deep in there, each one of these, assets are going to be just either JSON files or XML files, which is what we're going to be promoting. So if you look at the publisher, it got triggered here, which is great. Now, one thing you will notice in my environment, I highly recommend that you guys do the same, is we're going to go ahead and redeploy to that same environment from which we just extracted. May feel repetitive there, but the beauty of it is that it makes sure that you actually have all the checks and bounds, and then this way, by the time you go to production, you know that everything is exactly as it's supposed to look like. So once this completes right now, which is publishing to production, you will see all the APIs and all the named values, all the other assets, loggers, all that other good stuff, which was in the lower environment, all actually published into this higher environment. Now, remember, the extraction step is optional. I could have just easily, did all the coding in VS Code, checked in, triggered that publisher, and just push directly to my APIM instance as well. So we are catering. You can think about it as for both greenfield or brownfield, or maybe people who always like to do things in the portal and then promote them to higher environment versus those who like to do in VS Code and maybe push and promote. We got it all covered. So hopefully this is fine. We'll go ahead and refresh here. If we go here into the APIs, there you go. Just like that, all the APIs are in there. So that was our demo here. That pretty much covers the end-to-end demonstration of how APIOps really works. All right, so thank you so much, everyone, for actually spending the time here with us. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and please make sure you check our GitHub repo, talk to us, communicate to us via GitHub issues, and we will be more than happy to address any questions that you may have there. Thank you so much for actually attending this session around APIOps and how the idea of GitHub and DevOps actually supports having a good DevOps story for your next Azure APIM deployment. Bye-bye, everyone.